Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're firing up the time machine and heading straight back to the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Why? Well, because the Elizabethan era wasn't just about those massive, itchy ruffs and Shakespeare plays. It was literally the thrilling, wild, and incredibly experimental beta test for modern English prose. If you want to understand how our language became the dynamic tool we use every single day, we've got to look at its origin story.
For the longest time, English was kind of the underdog. It was completely overshadowed by other, supposedly fancier languages. But during the Elizabethan period, it swings from that underdog status to absolutely wild, vibrant extremes. And the main catalyst for all this, a massive, undeniable wave of national prestige and patriotism.
Which brings us to part one, the birth of modern English.
So, as the printing press really started to crank out mass-produced texts, English was finally pulled out of Latin's scholarly shadow. Fueled by this brand new wave of patriotism we just talked about, it was no longer eclipsed. It actually became this incredibly popular vehicle for everything from history books to thrilling travel adventures. Writers just started to fully, unabashedly exploit it.
And honestly, these writers were suddenly completely intoxicated with the use of the English language. They started borrowing heavily from ancient authors just to enrich their vocabulary. They took this sheer, giddy delight in using flowery words and grandiloquent phrases. It's like they had just discovered a shiny new toy and just wanted to press every single button at once.
So, what happens when you press all those buttons? Well, we enter part two, the euphemism epidemic.
This whole epidemic was sparked by a writer named John Lyly. Back when English prose was still kind of figuring itself out, Lyly steps up and drops a book called Euphues. And this book gave rise to Euphuism, an incredibly artificial and flamboyant style of writing. The crazy thing is, this wasn't just some niche trend for the elite. Its maxims were being quoted by royalty in the court and by everyday people down in the marketplace. It was literally meant to instruct courtiers on how to live their lives.
But Lyly's style wasn't just random chaos. It was highly engineered around three really rigid rules that built this wildly popular style. First up, antithesis and alliteration. Second, classical authority. And third, fabulous natural history.
Let's look at the first rule. Lyly loved to structure his sentences in two equal parts that sounded similar but carried completely different, often totally opposing senses. Take this line, of more wit than wealth, yet of more wealth than wisdom. It's incredibly catchy, isn't it? It just rolls right off the tongue, relying super heavily on that W alliteration while bouncing the concepts of wit, wealth, and wisdom right off each other.
Moving on to the second rule. You couldn't just state a simple fact. That was way too boring. Lyly's strict secondary rule required the writer to look backward to classical history to validate almost everything. Like, if you merely wanted to talk about the concept of friendship, you couldn't just say they were good friends. Nope. You had to deliberately cite the biblical friendship between David and Jonathan just to prove your point.
And then we have the third rule, which is where things get really weird. It relied on entirely fabulous, completely made-up natural history. Just listen to this. The bull being tied to the fig tree looseth his tail. The whole herd of deer stand at gaze if they smell sweet apple. Right. So the bull loses his tail because of a fig tree. That makes absolutely zero scientific sense. But to the Euphuists, it sounded delightfully dramatic and profound.
Now, looking back at all this flamboyant, artificial nonsense, you might think the book itself was totally superficial. But surprisingly, Euphues was actually packed with grave reflections and weighty morals. It heavily criticized the extravagant fashions of the day. So underneath all that intoxicating, flowery language, it actually maintained this puritanic tone that managed to push a genuinely liberal and humane outlook. Kind of a wild contradiction, right?
That brings us to part three, Sidney's poetic pastoral world.
While Lyly was dominating the court, another writer named Philip Sidney decided to push English prose even further into the realm of poetry with his massive work, Arcadia. And this book was influential. 200 years, that is how long various English authors relentlessly imitated it. Arcadia is officially recognized as the very first English example of a prose pastoral romance, establishing a legacy that shaped literally centuries of storytelling.
Sidney's Arcadia is set in this lush pastoral world where absolutely anything is possible, and it is massively long. Our sources note it packs in enough story to cover 20 modern novels. But its real magnetic pull was its highly poetical and exhaustive style. Sidney would take a single word and just use it again and again, tweaking the sense until every possible meaning was entirely wrung out.
Arcadia also heavily utilized something called the pathetic fallacy. This is basically establishing a deep connection between the outward appearance of nature and the internal mood of the artist or character. You know the trope, if the hero is sad, the sky starts weeping rain. This conceptual leap pushed Arcadia one massive degree beyond Lyly's Euphues, aiming directly toward absolute freedom and poetry.
But we can't forget part 4, the power of simple directness.
You see, physics tells us that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. If Lyly and Sidney are at the far end of the spectrum, just intoxicating the entire country with highly artificial, exhausting poetry, well, the necessary counterbalance sits right across from them. Writers like Mallory and Hakluyt anchored the era. Their style, simple, unaffected, direct storytelling.
Let's look closer at Mallory. He wrote the great prose romance Morte d'Arthur, diving deep into the rich, romantic treasures of the Middle Ages. But instead of wrapping his stories in flowery metaphors or that fake natural history we talked about, he used powerful, simple language. And because of that simple directness, his work proved to be an incredibly admirable and enduring model for Renaissance storytellers.
And then we have Richard Hakluyt, who wrote Voyages and other books describing epic sea adventures. Hakluyt is the ultimate contrast to the Euphuists. Our sources tell us he wrote with an entirely unaffected directness. He wasn't out there trying to show off his vocabulary or flaunt his classical education. He was conscious of only one thing. He had an incredible story and it was worth telling. He perfectly balanced out that wild pendulum swing of early English prose.
Which brings us to our ultimate takeaway. The Elizabethan era was this massive testing ground. Writers stretched English to its absolute breaking point with artificial extravagance and then regrounded it with beautiful, simple directness. They essentially built the toolkit we use today. So think about the media you consume right now, the emails you write, the books you read. Are we today still intoxicated by the flamboyant and the flowery, or do we ultimately crave the power of simple directness? The beta test might be over, but the way we communicate is absolutely still shaped by the choices made over 400 years ago. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.